Well, I appreciate the opportunity, as Kelly said, to come and talk to you again today. Being an academic, it's always important to understand where your science fits into trying to solve problems. And as I've gotten older and older over the years, I realize that if the science you do is only read by your academic friends, it doesn't do much. And so you have to bring it to the real world and try to do stuff. So one of the things I will tell you is I've gotten in the business, as I've mentioned maybe last year, we have a small farm in southwest Wisconsin, and we're going to start to grow medical marijuana up there. So I just completed the state of Wisconsin's application for a license and put a research plan in. So we're going to try a couple acres to see how it is. But the problem last year, it rained every week from June through August, and no marijuana grew anywhere in that part of the state. So we'll see. Those are the challenges. So today, I've been asked to talk to you a little bit about how soil health and agriculture fits into the larger ecological understanding of how what we call ecosystems function, and how they function relative to natural systems or agricultural systems, and why we need to understand how soil health and what we do fits in the larger context of the landscape. And so this picture that I have up here looks at two aspects of ecological systems. The one on my right shows what the ecological community looks at how ecosystems function. So we have, in a natural system, we have individuals and populations, we have communities, and we have ecosystems. And within that context, what we're trying to understand is what those interactions are and how they control what we see in the natural world. And that's always, and our understanding of how ecological systems function obviously has changed over time. And a lot of it is due to how we as people understand information. So the picture on the picture behind me with the agricultural group indicates also that while we look at how systems are structured naturally, and the science behind it is based on that natural system, indeed, humanity also creates ecosystems, and we can talk about agricultural systems or urban ecosystems, but they all function in the same way. They all are a part of how the land recycles carbon and nitrogen and uses energy and takes up water and moves that water around. But our understanding that and how we fit into that is, as Kelly said, it's based on a journey, but it's also based on how we are, as people, are biased, and how we can look at two pieces of information and come away with two very different outcomes. So I'm going to tell you a true story. When my wife, we were expecting our first child, it was a Sunday evening about 10:15, and she said to me, "John, I need you to run to the store and get some applesauce." And I said, okay. So I went down to, at the time, there was the Food Emporium where Yates Carpet is, if you know where it's at, on 19th and Frankfurt. And I went into the store and no one's around. And I went to get the aisle that had the applesauce. And I go to look, and the Musselman's applesauce, which she wanted, is in a glass jar on the top shelf. And I'm looking at the applesauce, and I'm looking at me, and I said, there's no way in hell I'm going to get that applesauce off that top shelf without breaking. So I walk out and try to find somebody, can't find anybody. And I go back into the aisle, and I'm standing there looking at the applesauce and trying to decide whether I should climb the shelf in order to get the applesauce down. And just about that time, middle-aged farmer comes in. He's about 6'2", and he looks at me, looking up and looking down, and he looks up the applesauce and picks the applesauce and hands it to me. And as I'm going to take it, he looks at me and he says, "They picked you a mite green, didn't they?" And I said, and I took the applesauce, and I said, "No, sir, they just left everybody on the tree too long." Right? But it points to the fact that both of us are looking at the same situation and drawing two very different outcomes, right? And the issue with understanding how we as scientists provide information to you and to other stakeholders really is part of that dilemma that we face, And as Kelly said, it's a journey. So part of what I want to do today is talk about a little bit about the science, share some things that I've learned, show you some of the places that I've worked in over my time. Because I've been a tech now for 34 years. I started this journey in '74 is when I started. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So this gives you a little bit about the outline of what this talk is going to be about. So I'm going to talk about what ecosystems are, how they function, why they're important, what they do for us, and then within that context talk a little bit about what agricultural systems are like, what controls them, and how you have to put the context of understanding soil health and what you do with your land within the context of ecosystem science, because soils and the plants that grow in them are not separate from the rest of the stuff that goes on in the system. You have to take more of a holistic approach. So what is an ecosystem? Well, from strictly a scientific perspective, it's a location in which we have a group of interacting organisms that occupy a specific space. So we can talk about grasslands, and we can talk about playas, and we can talk about cotton fields. And so, interestingly enough, ecosystems are our construct as to how the natural world works. That's how we look at it. How do these systems actually function? So we can talk about this mid-elevation grassland that I worked in at Big Bend, or I can talk about RN's field in Petersburg, and their ecological systems. And so the questions we want to ask is, what do they have in common? Does the rest of the natural world function like that, and what controls their function? Now, the important part is that ecological systems, ecosystems in particular, are all about interactions. And they're interactions with the biotic component. This is not just the microbes in the soil or the cotton plants or sorghum or corn you plant on that land, but it takes into context all of the organisms that occupy that natural system, the birds that move through, the rodents that run through, the nematodes that are in your soil, the earthworms that are in your soil. So it looks at how those interactions controls what that system does and how those biotic components interact with the abiotic environment. And so we'd have to take into account the whole concepts of temperature and moisture and relative humidity and the amount of sunlight and how precipitation falls and when it falls, nutrient availability, soil formation. So ecological systems are dynamic from that context. They're not a static entity. However, all ecological systems are influenced by the changes in the magnitude and strength of the abiotic characteristics. And so one of the factors that plays a very important role in how these things function is the stress that goes on the system, whether it's a drought, whether it's some disturbance from fire, whether it's plowing, whether it's chemical additions, whether it's anything that is going to disturb the interactions between the biotic component and the abiotic component. And from a managed perspective, what we're trying to do in agricultural systems is to control the stress, but at the same time allow the interactions between the biotic and the abiotic component that have to occur to be a positive impact and not a negative impact. So, what are the interactions that go on in natural systems that control what they do? Well, for a long time, ecologists thought that competition was the dominant interaction, and that is two organisms competing for resources and one winning out. Predation is another, right? Consumption of organic matter, consumption of other things in the system is an important part, because what it does is it helps move energy and carbon nutrients through the system. It allows that component to work more effectively. Herbivory is another. Herbivory is an important part of all natural systems. So those top three, competition, predation, and herbivory, for a long time were thought as the controlling factors in all ecological systems. But we now know that symbioses and the symbioses that occur in natural systems are probably the most important. in that if we don't allow those symbiotic interactions to occur between microbes and plants and other animals and fungi and bacteria that are in the system, then our system doesn't function well. And it can't do what we want it to do. So what are the kinds of symbioses that are necessary for soils to be healthy? What are necessary for productivity to be maximized? What's necessary for all ecological systems to function? And so we can have three different types of symbioses. We can have mutualism, in which both species exist, or both species benefit, I should say. And this is what we see as one of the dominant ones. We can have commensalism, in which one species benefits but the other really doesn't. And then obviously from an agricultural perspective, we don't want parasitism because that's disease. But in actual fact, the natural world already knows that cooperation is the most important interaction. We as humans like competition. That's why we play football, baseball, and everything else. But in terms of ecological systems are not functioning like that. Ecological systems function based on the ability of an organism to benefit the other organism. And if we don't allow that to happen, then the system doesn't work to its full capacity. I mean, think about that. That's why we have relationship issues, because it's all about competition, right? We try to outcompete our spouse, we try to outcompete our neighbor, we as nations try to outcompete each other. But in actual fact, the natural world doesn't work like that. Now, in order for those interactions to be manifested and to actually contribute to what the system has to do, you have to take into account the biodiversity within that system. In this cartoon version of ecological systems, we know that we need fungi and bacteria in our soils, right? Soils function like that, but you need bacteria and fungi to have an important role in that component. We know we need plants, we need spiders, we need birds, we need protists, we need animals moving through the system. The problem that happens when we start to manage ecological systems is that the biodiversity is reduced. And so what we're interested in knowing is how many species do we need? And of that context, what type of organisms do we need in order for that system to function properly? And that's a big challenge. And that's something that even today, after almost 100 years of trying to figure out how ecological systems function, we still are trying to work through some of these interaction patterns and know what they contribute. Because part of the problem is, like us, ecological systems are not static. They change over time, and you'll see why they change shortly. Now, there's another way of looking at these. What we want to find out is, what are the abiotic components that control the system? What are the biotic components that are in? Where are the biogeochemical cycles that control nutrients and cycling of energy and carbon? And we look at food chains and food webs. And so, depending upon what aspect of ecological systems you're interested in, we pick different parts of this to explore and to understand. And again, the main point of talking about this initially is to indicate to you that it doesn't really matter what system you're doing. This is occurring in your yard. This is occurring in your cotton field, in your cornfield, in the playa lakes. All systems on this planet function in this way. That's how they were made. And the problem is, when we as humans step in, what parts of these do we eliminate? And then what parts of the system cannot function the way they were designed to be made? Now, if you look at this figure here, this is the distribution, the current distribution of biomes or ecosystems across North America. And what you can see is we're in the shortgrass prairie ecosystem, the biome, and there's different types of biomes and ecological systems, eastern deciduous forests, savannas, across that landscape. And this is how science looks at what ecosystems do in North America. But this panel here indicates that's not what the landscape looks like. This is what the landscape looks like, because what this indicates is how much of that landscape is farmed. And what you can see is almost all the central corridor of the US, all those shortgrass prairies, sometimes almost 90% of that are in agriculture. So when you start to look at the functioning of ecological systems across North America, it's not this that is driving the system. It's you who are driving the system. It's you that are determining how those ecological systems function or do not function by depending upon what you do and how you manage that landscape. One of the projects that I do is that I work with a group out of University of Oklahoma. We are part of at Texas Tech what's called the South Central Climate Adaptation Science Center. It's a group of universities that are funded by the Department of Interior to look at climate impacts on the Southern Great Plains. But one of the things that you try to convince them is most of this landscape is farmed, and so unless you start paying attention to what the landowners are doing and how they're managing this, everything you do in terms of water or biodiversity has no real meaning, because that's not what the systems are about. Now, some major concepts about ecological systems and ecosystems in particular. As I keep mentioning, ecological systems are not static. Natural systems change over time, and it's a process that we call succession, in which the organisms that are growing in the system, primarily plants, but also the soil, what they do over time is they modify the system so that over time new things come in, new things change, and the system is always dynamic. And so what happens is we have a component in which you have agriculture. You're going to have primary succession, where you have this secondary succession. And you notice that there's something called a catastrophe, in which something changes in the system. But all ecological systems do this. There is no system on the planet that doesn't change with time. Now, in primary succession, this is pretty much what happens in river bottoms where you have flooding. This happens when glaciers regress and you have new soil. This happens when islands are formed in the ocean. And so you end up with this bare rock, and you see this gradual change of the composition of that landscape over time as a consequence of microbes and plants and the biotic component interacting, changing what you see in that landscape. And whether you realize it or not, this is exactly that happens every single growing season in a field. It doesn't matter what we do. You are starting to initiate some successional process that goes on in that field. Now, primary succession is one of these components that we know occurs, but it's not the major dominant successional type on this planet. We also know that when we look at the region in which we live in, our successional stages is governed by shortgrass prairie. We're all shortgrass prairie here, and the shortgrass prairie is the dominant natural vegetation type across them. That's what the system moves toward. This system, because of rainfall, because of climate, always moves toward grassland. Always moves toward grassland. However, there's another process that also operates, and this is something that you know of whenever you leave a field fallow. There's a concept called secondary succession, in which you have some catastrophic event, a fire, plowing, fallowing, in which now the system is pushed back to what happens once you eliminate that biomass, that vegetation above ground. You have to start the process all over again. And as this shows, again, different parts of the world have different levels of succession and time frames for it. But in the case, if you're back east, it's 150 years before you'll get back to the mature forest that was on that land. But the issue is, you know around here, that what happens if you don't plow? If you abandon those fields? Well, the system tries to go back to grassland, because that's the natural successional stage of this system. The question becomes, there's two things that are missing. We no longer have grazers in the system. We no longer have big ungulates that move through. And the other part is that because of our increasing climate variability, we start to see changes in how the system's actually going to operate. And this is one of the reasons why you see different weeds come into systems over time. is because of this natural process of succession. The plants are always trying to reclaim area that have been managed and disturbed. They will always do that. That's how they've evolved to respond to those kinds of processes. We want the good things that are in there, but you're always fighting and battling against this ecological concept of successional change, because ecosystems are not static and they will move towards some community that allows them to exist. Now, one of the reasons why ecological systems are important to understanding how the world functions is because we've begun to realize that these ecosystems perform a whole variety of services that are crucial for life to exist on this planet, including us. And so, if you didn't have ecosystems, they're the ones that produce O2 from photosynthesis, production of energy to support the environment, storage of carbon, decomposition, nutrient cycling, terrestrial water capture, and cleanup of human waste. All these are carried out by the interactions of the biotic component of these systems with the abiotic constraints on that environment. And again, my point in talking about this is whether you realize it or not, all of these are going on in every ecological system, whether it's natural or managed. They're going on in my front yard. They're going on in your cornfield. Now, which of these are influenced by plants? Which of these are influenced by plants? Of those that are up there, and of course some of them are easy. Obviously, plants are the one that are going to produce oxygen and fix CO2. Right? And then which of these are influenced by soil microbes? Well, these are the ones that are influenced by plants. Plants carry these out in all ecological systems. And then the ones that are influenced by the soil microbes, this is where soil health comes into play. Because again, soil health is only within the context of how ecological systems function. And what we see is that they take up decomposition, nutrient cycling, terrestrial water capture, clean up human waste. But notice one thing. The interaction between what the microbes do and what the plants do influences the storage of soil carbon. This is where soil health is important. This is how that whole nature of using the soil microbes to generate soil health is crucial, because it alone is controlled by both the plant and the microbes interacting. We can look at ecosystem services from other perspectives too, and people have done this to try to put an economic value, but we can talk about soil formation, fertility, we can talk about cultural and spiritual values. Kelly was mentioning this in terms of stewardship out of the Bible, carbon sequestration, recreation. Those are all part and parcel of what ecological systems do on this planet. The question that we have to ask ourselves is, in that whole process, how does agriculture fit into that? Where does agriculture fit in this whole question of ecological systems, ecological services? Or does it? Now, a couple things about ecosystems too that are important is that ecosystems are what we refer to as scale dependent, right? The size of the ecosystem can vary. So, the question is one field an ecosystem? Or does it include the areas around your farm? How much of the Southern High Plains is considered an ecosystem? And a lot of that's going to depend upon how you're looking at the movement of nutrients and carbon and energy among all those components, right? Is your front yard an ecosystem? The other component is that these concepts of ecosystem services that are crucial for how this planet functions are obviously a consequence of what happens with the interaction between the biotic and the abiotic. Now, there's another component to this, and this is oftentimes what we want to look at is, okay, is RN's cotton field functioning the same way as Barry's and Kelly's and other people around the region? Do they all fit into this? Do they function the same way, or is location dependent? And so oftentimes what we'll do is we'll aggregate these into what we call ecosystem functional groups, in which we look at levels of primary productivity, seasonality, phenology of how carbon is used. And so if you looked at the United States based on that, this is an indication of the ecosystem functional groups based on color across the United States. And so Here's Lubbock somewhere in there. And so what you can see, it has some aspect of the middle part of this where we're at, but also notice that it has a large amount of functionality similar to New Mexico and Arizona as an ecological system. The next part is, what's been my journey? Kelly mentioned that we all have journeys in which we participate in understanding how we learn about information. And we're not, like anything else, you're not born into being a baseball player or a good farmer or a good parent, you learn. And so for me, it's been an interesting journey in terms of understanding how I've understand how ecological systems function and what do we know about them. And so the question is this, what door would you step through? So I actually got my start in ecosystems working on prairie fires. And this was back at the University of Pittsburgh in the mid-70s. At this time, prescribed burning was just coming into a process that we thought was necessary for ecological systems. Because at the time, I grew up with Smokey the Bear, no fires anywhere, right? But what we began to realize is that some things have to burn. Prairies have to burn. Some types of forests have to have fires for rejuvenation. It's part of that successional process. And so one of the things that I was interested in looking at is when a fire moves across a landscape, how does it influence soil health? So we're not talking about catastrophic fires. Look what's happened in Australia this year. Look what's happened in California, where the intensity of the fire is so high, everything gets burned off. And so can you imagine in your field a fire going through and destroying the top 15 centimeters of your soil and sterilizing it? You wouldn't be able to do anything with it. And so the intensity of fires plays a role. But ecological systems that burn have evolved and have mechanisms whereby that fire passing over plays a role in the rejuvenation of that system, but also the microbes in there have evolved to deal with the fire. And so what I was interested in understanding is what happens to soil once it burns and the fire passes over, and what do the fungi do? Well, it turns out that there's a whole group of fungi that actually exist in all your soils. If you were to go out and burn one of your fields, either accidentally or on purpose, what you would see is all these fungi are starting to come up in your field that would not be there normally. And what these fungi do is they respond to the fire, they grow, and their role is to capture the nitrogen that's in your system so it doesn't leak out until the plants get reestablished. And so this is a small model that I had put together that looks at what these fungi are doing. And basically you have your fire, you have a whole series of microbial interactions, and then you have these fungi that grow and they sporulate and they produce spores, and what they do is they tie up all the nitrogen in the system so it doesn't leak out, it doesn't leach out, and as a consequence of that, the plants are able to take it up. And so natural systems have evolved these mechanisms so that they retain the nutrients that are in them. But if the fire is too hard, if it's too hot, it burns all this off, and then the system is worse off at the end. So do natural fires work? Yes, they do. So that's what got me started about working on fungi and natural systems. The second one was even more interesting. These are the Athabasca tar sands in Alberta, Canada. This is the XL pipeline. So what they do is this area of northern Alberta is jack pine lichen woodland. And they go in and they extract this oil-rich sand that's almost like tar, and they have to heat it up, but what you end up with is pure beach sand with nothing in it. And so the question is, how do you ever restore this kind of habitat to its natural set? These are highly disturbed soils. How do you reinitiate biological activity? So if the system's going to function as a biological system, you have to have biological activity. You have to introduce the microbes. Well, you obviously need some form of organic matter in it. And the question is, what kind of organic matter? Is it something that's easily used, or do you want it more recalcitrant? Right? This is the question we ask too in agriculture. You know, there have been attempts to put sugar and molasses in fields. Well, what does that do relative to spreading manure or putting straw and whatnot on a field? You need some form of nitrogen. And the question is, do you need it as an inorganic or organic form? And then you're going to need some other type of material. And in the case of these oil sands, what we're looking at is manure, sewage, sludge, or peat. What should you add in order to try to reinitialize biological activity? You can't add the microbes back. They're going to have to come in on a natural process. So what we did is we built these large macrocosms in which we actually brought down oil sand and put it in these large tanks that we called, and then we planted them with various types of plants, grasses and trees and legumes, and we let them grow relative to what the amendments were like to these soils, to see how the microbes responded, how the plants responded. And here's the sort of the short version of what we discovered after this, and this study ran for about 10 years. High nutrient applications delayed everything. You couldn't put too much fertilizer down because the systems, it's like giving a kid candy all the time, right? They're not going to do what has to be done. So you never want to go into a system and apply nutrients thinking that high applications of phosphorus and nitrogen are going to make the difference. They're not. But the important component is that the initial application of the amendment impacted the long-term success of the biological activity. So what that means is when you're moving to no-till, or when you're moving types of systems in ecological systems, what you do initially has to be well thought out, because you're going to get on a trajectory that's going to be very difficult to change later without a large amount of input in terms of energy cost. You can do it, right? But you have to understand what that trajectory needs to be and how carbon and nitrogen impact what that ecological system does. Some things only provide short-term benefits, while you want a long-term solution, and that's where the catch becomes. I've also worked in arid systems for a long time. I worked in the Trollan Desert outside of Las Cruces. I worked at Big Bend National Park, understanding temperature and moisture dynamics. This is a graph of what nitrate does at Big Bend, and I'll talk more about this tomorrow. But we're interested in understanding how these things influence ecosystems. We also understand how water and timing of water plays an important role. You know, if you have the capacity to irrigate, you know, on center pivots, you can eliminate some of these dynamics, but even continuous water is a detriment to ecological systems. Systems need some variability in them. If you're doing dry land, then timing of moisture is an important role. What we're looking at here is the application of water in summer, winter, and summer, winter, and then these ellipsoids show you that the microbial response is not consistent from year to year, and that at least in these arid systems at Big Bend, when water comes in, it's important to know when it's going to be added as to what the outcome is. But the important thing is, it's not consistent from year to year. And you shouldn't expect your soil health or what your system does to be consistent from year to year, because ecological systems don't operate like that. One of the more challenging projects we worked on is we actually worked at Fort Benning, Georgia. How does the Army manage its forests? Because as you may know, the Department of Defense owns the most federal land in this country. And so the question is, how do you manage a forest? How do you manage soil where you're actively training troops through this forest and mechanized vehicles, right? The Paratrooper Division patent trained at Fort Benning, Georgia. If you're interested in that aspect of history, it's a neat base to go on. It's sort of crazy because it's just rambling complex where people are firing off live ammunition around the base and whatnot. So you have to be careful. But we're trying to understand what these systems are doing. And one of the things we began to look at was temperature. And so these are systems that are not highly disturbed, and basically what this is looking at is air temperature and soil temperature over the year in terms of degrees. And you can see that in these systems that are not as disturbed, you have obviously soil temperature does rise a little bit above the air temperature because soils store heat. But look what happens when you start to actually disturb the system. You start to see these large differences in temperature between what that soil's doing and what the air temperature is doing. And we were looking at microbial responses, and here's the sort of the take-home message from Fort Benning. These three lines indicate a variety of conditions between high disturbed, low disturbed, and moderately disturbed systems. And what we discovered is that when the systems were actually not conducive for microbial activity, it really didn't matter whether you were in a low disturbed system or a high disturbed system. They all functioned the same. But when conditions were very good, the system that was the most disturbed did not have the capacity to respond positively to the same degree that the systems that were less disturbed did. And so this is an indication of when you start to manage agricultural systems, the more disturbance you have in them, the less likely they're going to respond positively even when conditions are good. Because the ecological processes have been disturbed to such a degree that they're not capable of doing that. Now, the question is, if that's how natural systems function, do agricultural systems function the same way? So what we did is we simply took all those concepts and brought them up to cotton fields, and we looked at what happens to cotton production, and this is dry land, in which we start to change temperature, and we looked at, and you've seen this in past years, we've been looking at levels of nitrogen and microbial biomass, and what we discovered is that if you simply look at a flat bed where there's no till in a pitch bed, what you see is during the growing season, because of temperatures and disturbance, this nitrogen does not get used up by the plant. It simply sits there. It doesn't get used. Even though you've added it, the plant's not using it because the ecological interactions between the biota are such that they leave it. Where in the systems that are less disturbed, you don't have those same types of fluctuations. Now, one aspect of ecosystems in general is they have what are called emergent properties, in which the complexity of the system is such that it's able to do things that you can't predict only from its component parts. And this is one of the I think one of the most intriguing aspects of ecological systems, and that is they are constantly trying to fit those interactions and respond to climate. And so as a consequence of that, you can't expect any ecological system to produce the same outcome when presented with the same input because of these emergent properties. And then another way of looking at this emergent properties is in this wheel is what do we want? So as Kelly mentioned about in the introduction, talking about your journey and moving into no-till and sustainable systems and soil health, you actually have to think about what services are important for your system and how you're going to help manage them or not manage them, but you don't want to negatively impact them because otherwise your system is going to require you to put more energy in. So how do we look at ecological systems? Well, obviously through time we look at carbon flow and nutrient dynamics, primary production. But if you had to think about and build these systems, what would they look like? And so you need soil, you need primary producers, you need nutrients, decomposers, you need air. So in actual context, these are the things that are common among all terrestrial systems. And you need energy, water. But what do they look like? If you model this, you have your primary producers, you have the decomposers, and you have the flow of carbon and nitrogen and CO2 back and forth within that system. So what's not in this model? You don't have any animals, right? The simplest functional system doesn't necessarily include animals of any type. But what do animals do? They are the grazers and the predators. And what they do is they regulate the transfer processes that are necessary for all ecological systems to function. And so in soils, you need to help not only develop carbon, but you need to develop this complex food web that occurs in soils, because you need to know who eats who and how that process works out. So this is an example of a complex food web that is necessary for any ecological system to function. So you have your types of carbon, you have your bacteria and fungi, you have your nematodes, and you have other predators in there. And all soils function like that. Now, if I say nematodes to most people, that's a bad word, right? Because of root disease and root knot nematode and everything else. But I want to show you some pictures that you may not realize what these things look like. But these are nematodes that are extracted out of a soil, right? And so if you go to any of your soils, if you have good healthy soils, you're going to have a lot of nematodes. And they're beneficial. But let me show you some of the characteristics. So again, some other parts of nematodes that are in soils. But what the nematodes do is they are the predators and grazers of bacteria and fungi, and they help recycle that carbon, right? And you can classify nematodes based on what they eat. So you can talk about bacteriivores that eat bacteria, fungivores, predators, omnivores, and root feeders. These are the ones you want to minimize. But if you disturb the system, what do you expect predominates? Your root feeders, right? Because what you do is you eliminate all these, and these just take over. And so that's why you have root disease with nematodes. So that's what a bacterial feeding nematode looks like. It has these little spatula at the tip of the mouth, and what they do is they go in your soil and they scoop out all the bacteria and they slurp them down like you're eating Cheetos. Right? And that's how these that's how these organisms move through the soil, right? And you need them because by eating the bacteria, they're recycling nitrogen and carbon back to the plant. This is a fungal feeding nematode, and this is an interesting one. What this fungal feeding nematode does is it has a hypodermic syringe that sticks it into the fungus and sucks out the juices. And these fungal feeding nematodes will feed on both the good fungi, but they'll also be important in controlling your root fungal diseases because they don't differentiate between the two. So you need them in your system. And then you have nematodes that eat nematodes, and so they'll slurp them down like spaghetti. And you need those in there in order to control what those nematodes are. I guess the way to say it, these are the lions of your soil. They're eating the gazelles, right? And so if you look at, in most ways, where the nematodes fall in terms of density, this pretty much shows you what the distribution is. But one of the other things, too, is there's a number of nematodes that will go after other insect larvae in your soil, and they'll control them. So that's one type. The other ones are your soil mites. These they're related to spiders, but they also do a number of things. So they eat nematodes, they eat fungi, they're predators, and they eat organic matter. And again, their role is to recycle material. So here's what they look like, right? They're growing in your soil. By the way, these are the same things that are dust mites in your house, right? These are the mites, by the way, I should tell you this. One of the neat things to do, if you're ever in a mood to show somebody, is take a white card and put it underneath your eyebrows and get a brush, and you can brush out the mites that live in the hair follicles of your eyebrows that keep you clean, right? So we're all part of the natural ecosystem of how carbon moves. So these are just examples of soil mites that go around and eat things, but this is what you need in order to have healthy, functional soil. Now, to finish this off, what about agroecosystems? How do they fit in everything we've talked about? What does it matter in terms of succession? What does it matter in terms of ecological services, ecosystem services? Can agricultural systems be part of what this process is? Well, somebody has tried to model this, and this is a very complex way of looking at how what you do impacts various ecosystem functions or services and what happens. So, you have ground cover management, irrigation, composition, structure of soil, impacting nitrogen leaching, infiltration, nitrogen uptake, nitrogen availability. So we can model it the same way that we look at how natural systems function. This is complex, right? And on a day-to-day basis, what you're trying to do is to maximize some of this. We can also look at, in fact, important for almost all agricultures, what nitrogen is doing. So you have your inputs, which are in green, you have your losses, which are in orange, and you have this cycling of nitrogen. But this is where your soil food webs come into play. If you don't have them, you don't have any of this cycling, what do you have? You only have losses. And this is one of the reasons why you keep having to fertilize year after year after year, because what you've minimized is this by what gets done. If you had to model this in another way, we obviously, in any ecological system, have the abiotic component, you have the biotic component, and you look at crops and weeds and other things that go on, the different subsystems of predators and herbivores. But one of the things that also governs you that natural ecosystems don't have is you have the socio-economic component that has to be taken into account. Right? Because you got to talk about commodity markets and economic and what China's doing or not doing in terms of understanding how you're going to sell your product and what's going to happen. So what do we know about what is the difference between how natural systems function and how agricultural systems function? And so if we look at this component up here, we have a very simplified version of the plant subsystem, herbivore subsystem, and the decomposer. And you'll notice that there is not much output, that most of the carbon and the energy in the system is self-contained. And again, this is going to be dependent upon the amount of disturbance, but natural systems are designed to be integrative and not have much loss. However, when you get down to an intensive agricultural system, what you see is the plant components reduced, herbivore systems reduced. You still have the decomposer subsystem to some degree, but you'll notice that the losses from it are much higher. And so the question is, how do you manage this so it looks more like the top? How do you ensure that it's going to be more of a self-contained system? Because what you're trying to do is decrease your inputs costs. And obviously, in terms of this meeting, a lot of what you do can be done going to no-till, but you also want to reduce nitrogen costs. You want to reduce fertilizer costs and everything else. So the question is, how much of that can be taken up in terms of contribution by allowing agricultural systems to function more like natural ecosystems? Now, the other part that's important for soil health is that, as I mentioned, disturbance plays a major role in any ecological system. And so we know, with respect to conventional tillage, that this part of the food web is all bacterial dominated. That fungi don't like to be disturbed because they get broken up, and as a consequence of that, your systems are bacterial dominated, and they don't do the same thing that the natural systems do. Whereas if you go to a no-till system, you still have the same components, but you'll notice that they're now driven by fungi and the food web parts that drive the fungi. So, you may be wondering, where is the seeing with new eyes come into all this? Anybody know who this is? Character of? Oh, you should. Hey, if you go to church, you should. This is St. Paul. Right? This is St. Paul. This is Acts 9, 1 to 19, right? And the reason is, part of the difficulty we have, whether it's anything we do as humans, is understanding how our eyes are covered with scales. And what don't we see? And part of it is we don't want to see it, because we don't know what to do with it. And we don't know how to approach it. And if you think about it, why did Christ impact Paul on that road? Why didn't he do it some other way or some other time? Because one of the things that we find is that we have to be in the right place at the right time in order for our scales to fall off. And that's part of the journey. Because oftentimes, we as people, we as anything we do in our lives, we are impacted by the people around us. And if you think about it, Paul had two conversions. One was the scales came off in terms of what Christianity meant to him, but also he was no longer physically blind. So you have to be involved in something else that's going to help you look at this whole question of soil health and soil dynamics in a much different way. So we go back to this question of secondary succession. The problem with all agriculture, and this includes both no-till and rotation, is you're always resetting the ecological clock back to zero. And part of the reason is you don't have long-term diversity in the fields. You are always modifying what the system is doing. Now, there's a benefit of going from conventional to no-till, most assuredly. But part of the challenge is if you're going to build these systems like ecological systems, you have to include some other diversity, because even though you rotate between corn and cotton and wheat or summer cover, you're still missing out on the biodiversity that has to be within that system. And the question is, can you do that? So you have to balance you have to balance your economic aspects with the services that have to come out of this system. And so what do you need? Well, you need consistent primary production. You need soil organic matter storage. And you need water infiltration. Those are the ecosystem services that you're trying to maximize in this whole process. And you need nutrient cycling. If these four can be addressed in some comprehensive way, then you can start cutting back on fertilizer application. But you're going to have to balance, because obviously most of the primary production may come off in some way, shape, or form. I'm going to end up with a couple of slides from some other people that talk about this in a much more definitive way. And so there are concepts out there called diversified farming systems, in which you try to maximize the diversity of what happens in this system. And over the years, we've talked about grazing systems and incorporating grazing. And as I said, natural systems have grazing as a component. How to maximize the plant diversity on your field? What would that look like? How would that be maximized? But you'll notice there are two things that are important. One is you're going to need to work on soil health, because without this, all the other functionings don't work in terms of what we've been talking about. And that you're going to have to figure out some way of maximizing components of landscape diversity, species diversity in time and space, and biomass production and recycling in order for it to act like natural systems. Now, one of the problems that I always have to deal with as a scientist is the following. You know, and this is particularly true of biological systems. If you said to me, what do I need to do to achieve this? It's something like, it's what, Kelly said this morning. Everybody has different aspects because of soil type and where they're at, and land production in terms of how their systems are going to respond to conversions. Science doesn't produce absolute results, right? It requires rethinking and retesting, because biological systems are not static. And so there's no absolute way to tell how to achieve that. And that's part of the concern. That's also part of the dilemma. But I like this. This was a quote that a minister gave to a congregation relative to thinking new ways about, in this particular case, it was about Lent, right, as we get to the season of Lent. But I like the quote: "This season, let go of limited beliefs and inaccurate notions and watch the scales fall from your eyes. What beliefs are you shedding this year, this season? What beliefs are you shedding?" And so, as humans, we come together in these kinds of workshops to hear and listen the wisdom from each other, and to take back what we can do that may actually have an impact on helping us be good land stewards. And as a scientist, there's no one answer. What we can provide are ways of thinking about the system. So I want to thank you very much for the opportunity to come and talk a little about ecosystems and processes, and I'm looking forward to hearing the rest of you talk and to getting some input so it helps my scales fall from my eyes. Thank you very much.